In the next few videos, we'll work with the remaining controls in the oscillator section: frequency modulation, or FM, ring modulation, and waveshaping, a distortion effect. In this video, we'll work with frequency modulation. We'll start by simplifying the lead synth patch used in this song. First, I'll disable the unison effect. We'll get a simpler sound without unison. Next, using the modulation zoom, we can see a list of prior modulations I set up, including mod wheel and velocity, controlling frequency modulation depth. You can hear the increase in growl as I bring up the mod wheel. The same is true as I increase playing velocity. I'll temporarily disable these with the mute buttons. We'll close the modulation zoom window. I'll continue to simplify the sound by disabling the filter section. I'll turn off the FM switch. Finally, I'll load the simplest possible waveform, a synthesized sine wave. In order to generate FM effects, Omnisphere contains a hidden extra oscillator, whose shape is selected in the bottom area. The momentary amplitude of our hidden oscillator controls the frequency of our audible oscillator, causing the frequency to rise and fall many times per second. The audible sound source is called the carrier, here a sine wave containing only the fundamental overtone. At super low frequencies, the modulator creates a simple vibrato effect. As I continue to raise its frequency, I'll eventually no longer hear the individual oscillations. New partials, called sidebands, are generated in the sound. Here's the original sine wave. Here's the fundamental with FM sidebands. Next, we'll look at the frequency of the modulating oscillator, controlled with this slider. It's the frequency relationship, or ratio, between the modulator and the audible oscillator that determines the frequencies of the sidebands. When this frequency relationship is an even multiple or fraction, then the sidebands are very harmonic. They're part of the overtone series and can sound very horn-like or warm. The hash marks are places where these even ratios occur. Modulator frequencies between these hash marks can generate non-harmonic sidebands that sound metallic, clangorous, or noisy. Next, I'll disable key tracking, which controls only the hidden modulator. There's the fundamental frequency of our primary wave plus the two sidebands. Playing a note one octave down, the fundamental shifts, but the sidebands do not. With key track off, the timbre of different pitches changes completely. For a consistent timbre across the keyboard, turn key tracking on. When the modulator tracks the keyboard, so does your tone color. Next, let's switch from a sine wave to a more complex modulating waveform. I'll try a triangle wave. The triangle modulator generates a richer tone. This is even more obvious with the sawtooth wave. Remember that the frequency slider controls which specific sidebands are generated and thus determines the basic character of the sound. The depth slider, on the other hand, controls the intensity of those sidebands once they've been generated. So you can create drastically different tone colors depending on your choice of frequency or modulator waveform. Therefore, when you think about modulating an FM type effect, it makes most sense to work with depth rather than frequency. This way, you can modulate the grit or intensity of a sound without totally changing its sound color. Remember that an easy way to set up these modulations is to simply right-click on the depth slider. I've already done this for mod wheel and velocity in this patch. The modulation zoom window gives me access to all of my existing routings. Here, I'll unmute my previous routings. Now I can use performance gestures to modulate the intensity of the FM-generated sidebands. In our last video, we looked at FM synthesis. sideband partials were generated when the modulator caused the frequency of our oscillator to rise and fall rapidly. In ring modulation, or amplitude modulation, there is also an unseen oscillator, but here it causes the volume or amplitude of our main oscillator to rise and fall. This can generate a different pattern of sidebands. At very low frequencies, we create a tremolo effect where the volume rises and falls discretely. As in FM, when the oscillations become rapid, we can no longer hear the individual changes, and sideband partials are generated. The frequency of the sidebands depends on the frequency relationship of the two oscillators. When that ratio is even, as indicated by the hash marks again, the sidebands are consonant or harmonic. Higher ratios produce higher sidebands. Unlike in FM synthesis, when both oscillators are sine waves, only two sidebands are generated, one above and one below the fundamental pitch. Choose triangle or sawtooth modulators to generate richer tones with additional sidebands. As with FM, with key tracking disabled, every note pitch will have a different timbre. Turn key track on for consistency across the keyboard. Now let's check out the depth slider, currently set to 50%. As I raise the depth slider, the fundamental decreases in volume until at 100% it doesn't exist. At a depth of 100%, we can hear only the sidebands. The fundamental pitch is gone and we lose our pitch reference completely. Here's this sound playing the lead part. At high depth values, the lack of a pitch reference makes the sound unusable. Lowering the depth value can give me a more usable sound with a more obvious pitch reference. So can choosing a simpler modulating waveform, which will generate less sidebands, such as this sine wave modulator. Choosing consonant ratios, such as 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, or 1, can also help if you're looking for sounds that are more musical and less metallic, non-harmonic, or noisy. Here's a simple sine wave transformed by ring mod. Next, I'll make the sound a little more out by changing the frequency to a non-harmonic ratio. There, the sidebands are too loud relative to the fundamental. Let's change that balance with the depth slider. Or we can go really out by turning off key tracking, using a non-harmonic ratio, sawtooth oscillator, and high depth. Those kinds of settings are great for your science fiction sounds. In this case, I personally prefer the more harmonic sounds generated by a frequency ratio of 1 and the simpler triangle modulator. Now I can raise that depth pretty high, and since the sidebands are harmonically related, it all sounds nice and rich. All that from a single sine wave oscillator with ring mod. The final process that we can apply in our oscillator section is waveshaping. Turning on the power for the waveshaper, we'll start again with a simple sine wave. Here, the waveshaper generates an additional harmonic above the original sine wave fundamental. I like to think of waveshaping as a digital form of distortion, as if you're overdriving a guitar amplifier. The depth slider controls the amount of distortion. It's sort of like a gain control to the input of an amplifier that you're overdriving. This virtual, overdriven amplifier can no longer properly represent the waveform and changes the output. A new wave shape is the result, containing distortion harmonics not present in the original. The 4 numbers below depth represent different mathematical algorithms for reshaping the waveform. Each algorithm is slightly more aggressive than the last, so number 2 generates an edgier sound with more harmonics. Let's sweep through algorithm number 3. Lots of high-frequency harmonics there. Algorithm 4 also has many high-frequency harmonics, but reduces the prevalence of the fundamental, sort of like using a high-pass filter. I like algorithm 2. Now let's check out the placement of the Waveshaper in the signal path between the oscillator, filter, and amplifier. First I turn on the filter, then I place the Waveshaper before it after the oscillator. Let's generate more harmonics by starting with a grittier sound source, a sampled Moog sawtooth. Now when we turn on the Waveshaper, we'll hear lots of harmonics generated. Distortion is generated prior to entering the filter, which is modulated by an envelope. The low-pass filter smooths out the harmonics. Now let's move the Waveshaper after the filter. The sound is filtered and then distorted. Now let's place it after the amplifier. In this case, all the distortion harmonics are generated after the filter and amplifier, both of which are shaped by their own envelopes. In these two examples, the amplifier and filter envelope change the source material being fed into the Waveshaper. This creates a nice contouring of distortion harmonics over time. Here's a little technical note. Omnisphere's Waveshaper is polyphonic. This tends to produce more musically useful results than if all combined sustained notes were run through a single Waveshaper. Next, let's check out the mix slider. Similar to the wet-dry ratio controls of a reverb or delay process, the Waveshaper allows you to choose how much of the unprocessed signal to mix with the processed signal. This makes a great parameter for modulation. Modulating with velocity allows you to translate the intensity of your MIDI keystrokes into a greater prevalence of the distortion harmonics. Now let's check out the gain slider and compare it to the depth slider. The depth slider can be thought of as an input gain control overdriving the algorithms. The gain slider is a volume control at the output of the process. This can create very different effects depending where in the signal chain the Waveshaper is placed. In this example, I'm varying the overdrive coming out of the oscillator into the filter. The low-pass filter smooths out the distortion overtones. Next, I'll increase the gain to overdrive the sound, but after the filter rather than before. The generated overtones are no longer smoothed out by the filter. This creates a much brighter, crisper sound. Finally, I'll again place the Waveshaper after the amplifier. The amplitude envelope is now prior to the Waveshaper. The output gain interacts with your momentary amplitude and filter settings, which change over time in response to the envelopes. So we've had a good look at every one of the parameters in the oscillator section. Let's see how we might combine Waveshaping with some of the other processes we've looked at already. Okay, I've got a nice growly sound. Now, let's add some ring mod. I'm going for that even ratio of 0.75, and I'll settle on a triangle modulator and moderate depth. Next, I'll add in a little FM spice with a simple 1.0 ratio, very moderate depth and sine wave modulator. Finally, I'll add some unison detuning to the stew, and we'll have created a very thick and rich lead sound, heavy in the harmonics. So we've learned quite a lot about the many processes available within the oscillator section to beef up your sound and totally reshape it. We can use the multiplier effects, harmonia, granular, and unison. We can use frequency or ring modulation. And finally, we can use the Waveshaper for polyphonic distortion. And don't forget to use modulation to help bring these effects to life in your music.